Princess Charlotte Augusta was the queen Britain never had, and one of the most tragic royal figures to boot. She was loved by the people, the hope of a dynasty and country, and yet her life was filled with strained tensions, dysfunctional family dynamics, and ultimately, her untimely death while still young. This video looks at her little-known life and how the events of it played into the wider issues of her time. Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales was born on January 7th, 1796, at Carlton House, the London residence of her father, George, Prince of Wales, who would later become King George IV, and her mother, Caroline of Brunswick. As the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, Charlotte's birth was of immense significance. She was immediately positioned as the heir presumptive to the British throne, second in line after her father. The nation rejoiced at her arrival, seeing her as the future of the monarchy. However, from the moment of her birth, Charlotte's family life was marked by deep dysfunction. Her parents' marriage was notoriously unhappy, and they separated soon after her birth. George detested Caroline from the start, and their relationship quickly disintegrated into bitter public animosity. The prince even tried to deny his wife access to their child, restricting Caroline's role in Charlotte's upbringing. Despite this, Caroline remained defiant, determined to have a relationship with her daughter. She would often parade Charlotte in public in a carriage, fostering a close bond with the British people, who sympathised with her struggles against the unpopular prince. However, as Charlotte grew older, her father successfully pushed Caroline out of court life, limiting their contact. Due to the breakdown of her parents' marriage, Charlotte's childhood was marked by strict supervision and isolation. While she held a prestigious position as the future Queen of Britain, she lacked the warmth and affection of a stable family. She was raised primarily by governesses and tutors, with limited direct influence from either parent. Her education, though extensive, was highly controlled by her father, who sought to mould her into the ideal constitutional monarch. She was instructed in languages, history, music, and decorum, but her learning was heavily restricted, ensuring that she never developed strong political ambitions that might challenge her father's authority. Unlike many European royal children, Charlotte was not sent abroad for her education. Instead, she was kept within the royal household, carefully watched at all times. Despite this, she displayed a lively personality, a strong will, and an independent spirit that often clashed with the rigid expectations of royal protocol. Charlotte's relationship with her father was complicated. While George carefully managed her education and public image, he was often emotionally distant. He saw her more as a political asset than a beloved daughter. He disapproved of her mother's influence, fearing that Caroline might turn Charlotte against him. This led him to limit Charlotte's freedom, making her life increasingly restrictive as she grew older. With her mother, Charlotte had a more affectionate but politically complicated relationship. Caroline was deeply resentful of her treatment by the royal court and often used her daughter as a symbol of her own victimhood. She sought to involve Charlotte in her public defiance of the Prince of Wales, taking her to public events and cultivating public sympathy for both of them. By the time Charlotte was a teenager, she struggled to balance her loyalties. While she loved her mother, she understood that Caroline's defiance could damage her own position at court. At the same time, she found her father's control overwhelming, making her increasingly frustrated with the lack of agency in her own life. Despite the dysfunction of her family, Princess Charlotte was beloved by the British public. She was seen as a refreshing contrast to her father, whose extravagant lifestyle and unpopular political decisions made him widely disliked. Charlotte's natural charm, lively personality, and warmth endeared her to the people. Many saw her as a future queen who could restore dignity and moral integrity to the monarchy. But she was also known for her rebellious streak, often pushing against the constraints placed upon her by court life. She disliked excessive formality and had a free-spirited nature that made her relatable to ordinary people. Unlike her father, who was seen as detached and self-indulgent, Charlotte appeared to be genuinely interested in the well-being of the British people. By the early 1810s, as she entered adulthood, Charlotte's role as heir presumptive became a focal point of national interest. Would she be allowed to choose her own path? Or would she remain trapped under the control of a distant father and a dysfunctional royal court? As Princess Charlotte neared marriageable age, her father intensified his efforts to arrange a politically advantageous union. As the heir to the British throne, Charlotte's marriage was not simply a personal matter, it was a state concern. Her husband would not only influence British politics, but could also shape the future of the monarchy itself. In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain sought to strengthen its alliances through dynastic marriages. One of the strongest candidates was William, Prince of Orange, the heir to the Dutch throne. A marriage between Charlotte and William would have solidified Britain's relationship with the Netherlands, creating a powerful Protestant alliance in Europe. For George, the match was ideal. It aligned Britain with a strong Protestant ally, satisfied diplomatic concerns, and ensured that Charlotte's influence would be diminished, as she would be required to live in the Netherlands after marriage. However, Charlotte herself had other ideas. Unlike many princesses of her time, Charlotte was strong-willed, independent, and deeply aware of her own value. She refused to be treated as a mere pawn in her father's political strategies and was determined to marry for personal happiness, not just duty. When she met William, she found him unimpressive. She disliked his manners and, more crucially, resented the requirement that she leave Britain and live in the Netherlands after their marriage. Charlotte's reluctance quickly turned into open defiance. In 1814, after months of pressure from her father and the British government, she agreed to an engagement with William. However, she never truly accepted the match, and her rebellion against it became one of the most dramatic royal conflicts of the era, bolstered by an actual meeting with William, where he turned up drunk. Not the best way to impress your future royal bride. Soon after the engagement was announced, Charlotte began expressing doubts. She confided in her close friends that she had no intention of leaving Britain. Her breaking point came when she realised that if she married William, she would be expected to permanently relocate to the Netherlands, leaving behind her people and her home. In a dramatic act of defiance, Charlotte broke off the engagement in June 1814. She stormed out of Warwick House, her residence at the time, got into a carriage and rushed to her mother's house for support. This open rebellion shocked the British royal court. No princess had ever so publicly defied an arranged royal marriage, let alone fled to her estranged mother's house in protest. Charlotte's actions sparked a public sensation. The British people, who were already deeply sympathetic toward her, saw her as a heroine, standing up against her father's control. While George and his advisors were furious, public sentiment was overwhelmingly in Charlotte's favour. The engagement was officially called off, but the incident left deep scars on her relationship with her father. Following the broken engagement, Charlotte's popularity soared. She had refused to be forced into a marriage she did not want, and the public saw her as a determined, independent future queen. Meanwhile, George tightened his control over her, restricting her movements and isolating her from society. Her father attempted to reassert his authority by suggesting other suitors, but Charlotte was no longer willing to be manipulated. She wanted to marry for love, not just for political convenience. Over time, she began to take an active role in choosing her own husband, seeking someone she admired and respected rather than a purely strategic match. During this period, she became increasingly drawn to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a minor German prince with no major political entanglements. Leopold, while not as powerful as the Prince of Orange, possessed qualities that Charlotte admired. He was cultured, intelligent, and had a reputation for being honourable and kind. Her father didn't actually actively dislike him, and was very impressed with a letter sent to him by the prince, but he still wanted to push Charlotte towards a more politically impressive match. But by 1815, Charlotte had set her heart on Leopold, but she knew she faced another battle with her father. Charlotte's determination to marry Leopold led to a lengthy and bitter struggle with her father. George viewed Leopold as an insignificant prince, lacking the political weight of the Dutch royal family. He repeatedly tried to dissuade Charlotte, offering her alternative suitors and delaying the approval of the marriage. However, Charlotte was unwavering. Unlike the first time, she refused to be pressured. She stood her ground, insisting that she would not marry anyone but Leopold. The public, still sympathetic to her cause, supported her choice, adding further pressure on the royal court. Eventually, Charlotte won. After months of resistance, George finally relented and gave his approval for the marriage. It was a rare victory for a royal woman of her time, proving that Charlotte's determination and public support could influence even the most powerful forces around her. On May 2nd, 1816, Princess Charlotte and Prince Leopold were married in a lavish ceremony at Carlton House. The British public rejoiced, celebrating the princess who had fought for her own happiness. The marriage was seen as a new chapter of hope and stability. Charlotte had secured her freedom, chosen her own husband, and seemed destined for a bright future as Britain's next queen. Unlike the scandal-ridden marriage of her parents, Charlotte and Leopold presented a refreshing image of stability and genuine affection. The British people, weary of George's extravagant lifestyle and public disputes with his estranged wife, saw in Charlotte and Leopold a hopeful contrast. A young couple deeply in love, untainted by the controversies of the court. For Charlotte, this marriage represented not just love but freedom. Having spent much of her life under the strict control of her father, she now had the opportunity to build a life of her own, away from royal restrictions and political manipulation. Shortly after their wedding, Charlotte and Leopold settled at Claremont House, a grand yet relatively modest country estate in Surrey. Unlike the stifling atmosphere of the royal court, Claremont offered a sense of peace, privacy, and simplicity. Charlotte quickly embraced her new role as a wife and future queen. She thrived in the domestic environment, preferring a quiet life with Leopold over the lavish excesses of the court. She spent her days walking through the gardens, riding horses, reading, painting, while also engaging in charitable activities. Despite being a princess and heir to the throne, Charlotte rejected much of the formal pomp and etiquette that had surrounded her at court. She and Leopold were often seen behaving like any other ordinary married couple, enjoying long conversations, meals together, and shared hobbies. Leopold's influence in Charlotte's life was significant. She trusted him deeply, and for the first time, she had a partner who truly supported and respected her. While George had manipulated and controlled her for years, Leopold treated Charlotte as an equal, offering her both love and wise counsel. Charlotte's natural warmth, independence, and defiance of royal traditions only strengthened her popularity among the British people. She was seen as a progressive figure, a stark contrast to her scandal-ridden father. Whereas George was known for his extravagance, mistresses, and political failures, Charlotte represented youth, renewal, and a promising future for the monarchy. She openly expressed her desire to be an active and engaged queen, focused on social issues, military affairs, and charity work. She was especially interested in helping the poor, advocating for better treatment of the lower classes, and reforming outdated laws. The British people adored her for this. She was not only their future queen, but a symbol of hope for a fairer, more just society. Charlotte's letters from this period reveal that she was happier than she had ever been. In one, she wrote to a friend, "Leopold is everything I could have wished for, and I feel I am at last where I belong." In early 1817, Charlotte's happiness seemed complete when she became pregnant. The news sparked immense excitement across Britain. After decades of instability, the country was eager for a secure royal succession. Public celebrations erupted, and many saw Charlotte's pregnancy as a guarantee of the monarchy's future. If she gave birth to a healthy heir, Britain would have a stable line of succession, free from the uncertainties of previous years. George IV, despite his strained relationship with Charlotte, was delighted at the news. He recognized that her child would be the key to securing his dynasty, and he began making grand plans for the future of his soon-to-be-born grandchild. Charlotte herself embraced her pregnancy with enthusiasm, preparing eagerly for the arrival of her child. She followed medical advice of the time carefully, ensuring she did everything possible for a healthy delivery. However, while the nation rejoiced, there were already warning signs that Charlotte's story would not have the fairy tale ending many hoped for. Though she was young and generally healthy, her pregnancy was more difficult than expected. She suffered from severe morning sickness, exhaustion, and moments of extreme fatigue. Additionally, medical practices of the time were dangerously outdated, and the doctors attending to her were not well equipped to handle complications. Despite this, Charlotte remained hopeful, convinced that she was about to step into her ultimate role as a mother and future queen. By the autumn of 1817, Charlotte's pregnancy had become the most eagerly anticipated event in Britain. The people were deeply invested in her journey, with newspapers reporting on every detail of her health and preparations. Charlotte and Leopold continued to prepare for parenthood together, with Leopold ensuring that she remained calm and supported. He was known to be deeply attentive to her needs, often putting aside his own affairs to spend time with her. Yet, as her due date approached, signs of trouble began to emerge. Medical experts at the time lacked the knowledge and resources to properly care for high-risk pregnancies, and Charlotte's physicians failed to recognize potential complications. By November, Britain was anxiously awaiting the birth of Princess Charlotte's child, hoping for a healthy heir to secure the royal succession. However, Charlotte's pregnancy had been fraught with difficulties, and despite her outward optimism, concerns about her health were growing. Charlotte went into labour, and what should have been a moment of celebration turned into a nightmarish ordeal. Her labour lasted over 50 hours, an agonisingly long time even by modern standards, never mind standards of the period. Her attendants and doctors, including the royal physician Sir Richard Croft, did not recognise the early warning signs of distress. Medical knowledge in the early 19th century was woefully inadequate, particularly regarding childbirth. The prevailing belief was that intervening too much in the natural birthing process could do more harm than good, leading Croft to adopt a hands-off approach, which ultimately proved catastrophic. Despite her exhaustion, Charlotte endured the painful, drawn-out labour with remarkable resilience. Those attending to her later remarked on her bravery and determination as she struggled through contractions for 2 days without modern pain relief or medical interventions that might have saved her. By the time the baby was finally delivered, it was stillborn, a devastating outcome. The boy, who would have been second in line to the throne, was described as perfectly formed and large, suggesting that his death may have been due to the prolonged labour rather than any inherent health defect. The news was heartbreaking for Charlotte, who had fought so hard to bring her child into the world. She was devastated, but at first appeared to be recovering. Those around her felt that despite the deep emotional pain, she had at least survived, and with time, she would heal. But in truth, the danger was far from over. As the night progressed, Charlotte's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. She had initially seemed stable, even managing to speak to those around her. But suddenly, her health took a terrifying turn. She became cold, clammy, and weak, showing signs of what modern doctors now suspect was either a postpartum hemorrhage or a pulmonary embolism. Leopold, who had been present for much of her labour, had finally collapsed into an exhausted sleep, believing that his wife was out of immediate danger. Tragically, he was awoken too late, having also been given a sleeping draught beforehand to help him. As Charlotte's condition worsened, her attendants panicked, unsure of how to proceed. Sir Richard Croft, who had already made catastrophic decisions during her labour, failed to act quickly enough to stop the bleeding. By the time he realised the severity of the situation, it was too late. Charlotte died in the early hours of November 6, 1817, at just 21 years old. The royal household was thrown into immediate chaos, unable to comprehend the enormity of the loss. The nation had expected a joyful announcement at the birth of an heir. Instead, the news that both Charlotte and her son were dead sent shockwaves throughout Britain. This was a national tragedy, on par with the death of Princess Diana in the late 20th century. Charlotte's death plunged Britain into a mourning period unlike anything seen before. People were devastated, disbelieving that their young beloved princess was gone. Charlotte had been the people's princess, a figure of hope and renewal for the monarchy. With her death, that hope was shattered. Many businesses closed for weeks. Black mourning cloth sold out across the country. Shops were covered in black drapes, and thousands of people dressed in mourning attire. Even those who had never met Charlotte felt an overwhelming personal sense of loss. Poets, artists, and writers produced works lamenting her passing, and public memorials sprang up across Britain. One London newspaper captured the nation's sorrow, writing, "It is as though the light has gone out from the nation. We are left in darkness and despair." While the public was in deep mourning, those closest to Charlotte were utterly devastated. Her father, George, was inconsolable. Though their relationship had often been strained, he had still counted on Charlotte securing the future of the Hanoverian dynasty. Now with her gone, the line of succession was in crisis. Her mother, Caroline of Brunswick, was living in exile in Italy at the time. Upon hearing the news, she was so overwhelmed with grief that she fainted. She later lamented that she had been denied the chance to see her daughter one last time. But the most profound grief belonged to Prince Leopold. He had genuinely loved Charlotte, and her death left him utterly broken. He reportedly refused to eat or sleep for days, spending much of his time in silent mourning. Those around him feared for his health, and he withdrew from public life for an extended period. He later wrote to a friend, "The world is now a blank for me. The being who gave me happiness, who made my life worth living, is gone. I have lost everything." Leopold never truly recovered from Charlotte's death, although he did eventually remarry around 20 years later, and later became King of Belgium. However, he always kept a portrait of Charlotte in his room and spoke of her fondly until the end of his life. His daughter with his second wife would also be named Charlotte or Carlotta in her honour. Charlotte's death also had huge political consequences. With her gone, the Hanoverian dynasty faced a major succession crisis. There were no legitimate heirs, as George had no other surviving legitimate children. Charlotte's death triggered what became known as the rush to the altar among the remaining unmarried sons of George III. At the time, none of them had legitimate children. Many were either bachelors or had only fathered illegitimate offspring who were not allowed to inherit the throne. With the monarchy's survival at stake, these aging princes scrambled to marry European princesses and produce a new heir. The most successful of these efforts came from Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, George III's fourth son. In 1818, he married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the sister of Charlotte's widowed husband Leopold. Their daughter, Victoria, was born in 1819, just 2 years after Charlotte's death. Victoria would go on to become one of Britain's greatest and longest reigning monarchs, ruling for over 63 years and shaping the course of the 19th century. In this way, Charlotte's death directly paved the way for the Victorian era. Had she lived and given birth to an heir, Victoria would never have been queen and probably would never have even existed, and Britain's history might have been drastically different. Charlotte's tragic death also sparked debates about medical practices. Many blamed Sir Richard Croft, whose mismanagement of the birth had led to disaster. He was overwhelmed with guilt and in 1818 took his own life, writing that he could never forgive himself for failing Charlotte. In the aftermath, the medical community began questioning the wisdom of the hands-off approach to childbirth. Charlotte's death became a catalyst for slow but eventual changes in midwifery care, though it would be decades before childbirth became significantly safer. Though Charlotte never became queen, her life and death reshaped British history in ways few could have predicted. Her passing triggered the race to produce an heir, directly leading to Queen Victoria's birth and reign. Her husband Leopold became one of the most influential European monarchs, and her tragic death changed the course of medical history. Above all, Charlotte's unfulfilled potential made her a lasting symbol of lost hope. She remains one of the most mourned figures in British royal history, a reminder of what could have been, the Queen who never was, but whose impact was deeply felt for generations to come.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.